Gold and silver are the only form of money mentioned in the US Constitution, the document that you swore to uphold. I can't really make that argument on the Bitcoin side. The vast majority of the more than 8,000 elected state legislators across the United States had never heard the term sound money. They had never asked themselves questions, very simple, fundamental questions. There has to be a better alternative than a political money, the United States dollar. And more, these countries around the world, obviously states and individuals and central banks all around the world, as reflected by the massively rising gold price, are coalescing back around gold because it is non-political, non-inflatable money.
Welcome to another RTD interview. Today I'm excited to have returning guest, Mr. JP Cortez. He is the Executive Director of the Sound Money Defense League, which is a leading state effort to restore sound constitutional money. And today he's joining us to share his thoughts on a variety of subject matter, geopolitics, metals, as well as the current landscape within our country. And as always, it's good to connect with like-minded individuals that really share a heart and passion for getting out truth. And so let me bring him on here. How are you doing, JP?
Hey, Mike, great to be back with you. Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure, my good friend. As always, is looking forward to connecting. And I was looking at the last time we connected, and if I bring it on the screen real quick here, it looks like we last connected in 2024, April 13th. And so since then, lots of things have changed, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you're keeping your eyes on, and of course, what excites you, what concerns you. So feel free just to let us know from where you stand, everything that you've been paying attention to. I guess what are some things that really excite you at this current moment?
Well, it's been incredible. Everything from, like you said, you can look at the markets, you can look at actual gold prices, at gold and silver prices, and obviously there's so much energy and buzz around just that topic. You can look at things that are a little more nuanced, a little more specific. You know, for example, just today or just in the last couple of hours, there was recently announced that the US and Argentina, or I guess that was yesterday, some sort of intervention happening there. We can look at legislation at the state and federal level, and we see that all of these things are happening. And we find that what I'm finding is that all of this is a tailwind for gold and silver, not just as money, but as an investment. So you have, at the state level, we can start there. In 2024, when we last spoke, there were two really interesting things that were going on. The first was in Kentucky, because in Kentucky in 2024, we passed legislation that said that the state of Kentucky would not charge sales tax on purchases of coins, bars, and rounds made of gold, silver, and other metals. Upon duly passing that legislation by the full legislature, the governor vetoed the bill unconstitutionally. The attorney general came out and said the Constitution says you don't have the power to use vetoes on this type of bill. The governor said, I don't care, I'm doing it anyway. And he directed all of his departments to continue collecting this tax with penalty of fines from the state. So we had a constitutional battle brewing in Kentucky, where you had a tyrannical, a power-hungry governor deciding that he was not going to act. He was not going to do what the legislature rightfully passed. In fast forward, at the time, this was a huge deal, was a constitutional battle breaking out. And at the time, Kentucky was slated to be, I believe, the 45th country or state in the United States to end this sales tax on purchases of metals. So this was a big deal. At the same time, on the other side of the country, in Idaho, we had passed this legislation that allowed the state of Idaho to hold physical gold as a reserve asset on its balance sheet. The Governor Brad Little, decided to veto this bill. The bill did not mandate purchases. It did not even have a fiscal note. The bill was only to give the treasurer permission to invest in gold and silver if they wanted to. That's important because you look towards today and you can see that Idaho has lost out on so much potential windfall from investing in these assets, all because their governor decided, no, I don't want to give my treasurer or my departments the right or even the option to do this. So at the state level, Mike, we're seeing more and more, we've got pushback from people in power who think they know money, who think that they know the system, who have this central planning mindset at all times. But the flip side of that is that more and more states are passing this legislation. In 2024 and 2025, we've got more than a dozen states now that have enacted gold and silver laws, laws to end sales tax, laws to end capital gains tax, laws to end gross revenue or commercial activity taxes, laws to establish multi-million-dollar gold reserves, laws to reaffirm its constitutional status as money. So, we've got these people in here. We've got a couple of power hungry politicos who are trying to make sure, that the people don't have access, don't have the right to acquire the only form of money mentioned in the Constitution without being harmed by the state. But by and large, it is the path forward is unbelievably clear at the state and the federal level, where we have more and more of these projects being introduced and ultimately being enacted into law.
Interesting. Now, based upon the current position that you guys are in with those states you just mentioned, so is it more so a wait and see, or is it continue to just press in and put more pressure on the governor or there? Or I guess what will be some of the follow-up steps that you and your entity will look to try to push?
In the case of Kentucky, what we did here in 2025 was reintroduce a bill that was introduced by Representative T.J. Roberts in Kentucky. He introduced a bill that said, one, this sales tax exemption is going to be active, and it's going to be active, retroactive to the original passage date by the legislature in 2024. The second part of this bill that he introduced said that it created a pathway for people who had been taxed on purchases of gold and silver in Kentucky to sue the governor, to personally sue the governor and his departments for violations. I believe were a penalty of $1,000 a day of these politicians who acted against the rights of precious metals buyers and investors. So what we did immediately after in Kentucky was pass legislation that enticed, it created a mechanism that taxpayers, wrongfully applied taxpayers, can seek retribution, can seek some sort of payment, some sort of justice for the wrong that they had suffered at the hands of Andy Beshear, governor of Kentucky. In Idaho, it's the same thing. Governor Brad Little vetoed that bill. The next year, what we did, we left the reserve issue alone. Instead, what we did was we came in with two other bills. One was a bill to remove the capital gains tax on sales of precious metals in the state of Idaho. So when you sell your gold, if you experience a gain, there's still a federal tax, but the state no longer will tax you. That was part of the biggest tax cut in state history. And the second thing we did was passed another bill reaffirming gold and silver as money. So working with legislators in the state to introduce this and to work it all the way through the process and to ultimately pass these bills into law. And so now we've seen, and in Idaho's case, it even highlights even further the disastrous veto by Governor Brad Little back in 2024, where, not only has the state lost out on millions of dollars, which it certainly has, you're seeing now that the state itself has completely changed posture as to the way it relates to gold and silver, where now they're removing taxes on the metals. Now they're reaffirming its status as constitutional money. Idaho is embracing gold and silver at a time where its highest executive, the state governor, is running in the opposite direction of that. And fortunately, the legislature has won out, and we're seeing, that's what happened this year. Next year, Idaho is also planning on introducing some of these other bills. So like you said, it's a constant press forward. And even in the cases where, things might not go our way or when the politicians might have won a battle, they certainly don't win the war long term, the same way gold and silver as money are going to win out long term.
Now, as I bring up the Sound Money Index here, which is a map of all the activity that you guys have been putting forth. And so there we go right there. And so I guess since we've last connected, give me a little idea as to what perhaps is, outside of the two states you mentioned, where else have some states progressed in making more sound money policies for their people to date?
It's been fantastic, Mike. And like you said, you can find these results at the 2025 Sound Money Index. I'm actually currently in the process of working on the 2026. So we'll have that version out before the end of the year with all of these updated scores. But yeah, like you said, Mike, this is something we put out every year in concert with Money Metals Exchange, National Precious Metals Dealer and Depository. And what we do with the scorecard is we rate all 50 states based on their anti or their pro sound money policies. So we're ranking states based on their tax positions towards the metals. We're ranking them based on whether or not they've reaffirmed gold and silver as legal tender, whether they have established physical gold reserves, whether they've invested or issued gold bonds, for example, and so much more. So this year, with everything that has happened, 2025 being our legislatively most successful year in our history since 2014, this year we had more projects than ever. More than 63 legislative bills were introduced throughout the country in more than 30 states. So the majority, nearly 70% of the country, is actively considering ways to re-implement gold and silver back into their systems. So like I mentioned earlier, Idaho and Kentucky obviously stand out. Wyoming this year just passed a $10 million physical gold reserve in their state. We worked with legislators, specifically Senator Ide in Wyoming, who is a sound money champion. So this year, Wyoming passed a bill establishing a $10 million physical gold reserve to hold on their balance sheet. That follows Utah, who last year in 2024 approved I believe it was $180 million physical reserve. And there are more states that are doing this and considering it. In Alabama, so going now from the west back east, Alabama passed its fourth sound money bill since 2018 this year. So in 2018, we expanded the sales tax exemption to make sure that purchases of gold and silver are not taxed. And then we moved a sunset that was set to expire, and we passed another piece of legislation expanding it out. And then we passed legislation removing state capital gains taxes in Alabama. And then most recently passed one reaffirming their status as legal tender or constitutional money. And next year, again, we're going to look at reserves. We're going to look at bolstering these state funds, because across the country, state treasurers and the people making these decisions are looking around at their balance sheets, and they realize that we are loaded with dollar-denominated debt, a giant majority of which, or a lot of which at least, it has negative real rates of return. So, you've got these balance sheets where you have assets on them, and you're saying, okay, great, I'm earning 4% on this, I'm earning 5% on this. But if inflation is truly closer to 7 or 8%, what you're telling me is that you're losing 3 to 4% year over year. And that is not, that is not something that can remain that way, especially when you're talking about protecting the fiduciary responsibility that you have to taxpayers or to pension holders or to whatever it may be. So states are waking up to this, and that's at the state level, obviously that's true. At the federal level too. Mike, you've talked about it on your show. De-dollarization is a thing. These BRICS countries have been talking more and more loudly about looking at ways to cut out the United States dollar. To be sure, a lot of that is self-inflicted. A lot of that comes from the United States weaponizing the dollar, using it as a political cudgel. And now, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, where the United States took Russian assets and seized them and then kicked them out of the SWIFT system, these countries, adversaries and allies alike, are saying, wait, there has to be a better alternative than a political money like the United States dollar. And more, these countries around the world, obviously states here in the United States, and individuals and central banks all around the world, as reflected by the massively rising gold price, are coalescing back around gold because it is non-political, non-inflatable money.
Interesting. Now, I'm curious to get your thoughts because you guys do a good job focusing on sound money, gold and silver, but yet the narrative has changed a lot since this new administration has come into place, because a lot of what this administration ran upon is, I guess, the Bitcoin narrative. And so Donald Trump promised the Bitcoin strategic reserve. Looks like he's backtracked a little bit. A lot of people weren't too excited about that. He's opened it up to all types of cryptos. He has his family crypto industry now that's booming. And so there's a lot of concern there. But, at the federal level, it was supposed to be something that was being worked on. But the states have appeared to step in because they too want to, I guess, protect themselves from the very same, issues you just mentioned with gold and silver. And I want to share with you a graph here that just shows some of the latest Bitcoin reserve tracker. And so here you can see the states that are against it, some that are for it, the ones in green, and the ones that are currently processing whether or not they're going to do it or not. Do you see, perhaps in the upcoming days ahead, any type of collaboration or collaborative efforts by the politicians to do both gold and silver and Bitcoin? Or will there be an inflection point to where you run into some problems where they say, no, gold and silver was then, we want to go to what's now, because it appears that the West has adopted that digital mindset, whereas, as you mentioned, the Eastern region is focused on the tangible mindset. What are you thinking about all this?
That's a really interesting point, especially as it pertains like east to west, because you're completely right. If you've spent any time out in the eastern part of the world, you see that gold is revered still. It is a cultural touch point. It's religious. It's monetary. For many reasons, gold is still respected out in the eastern part of the world in ways that it isn't here in the West. I think that we're already seeing, at least at the state level, we're already kind of seeing a diversion of paths here. For example, in Wyoming's case, like I mentioned just a bit ago, Wyoming recently passed a $10 million physical gold reserve. At the same time, they considered a Bitcoin reserve, and that didn't make it anywhere. There are other states where that has been the case as well. So I think there are different arguments. I know that it's very common kind of to wrap them under the same sound money argument, at least, or the sound money blanket, or at least that's the way proponents of Bitcoin primarily are choosing to frame it. And I understand why you would frame it that way. You're leaning into the kind of the digital gold argument. But the reality is that as assets, they act completely different. And frankly, the arguments are different. When I go into a state and I talk to people who are conscious of the fact that they put their hand on a Bible and swore an oath to the United States Constitution, I can say to them, gold and silver are the only form of money mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, the document that you swore to uphold. I can't really make that argument on the Bitcoin side. I also think that it's probably worth noting that, until, like I mentioned, the Sound Money Defense League started in 2014. At that time, and even years in, the vast majority of the more than 8,000 elected state legislators across the United States had never heard the term sound money. They had never asked themselves questions, very simple, fundamental questions like, what is money? Why do we use it? What societal tool or what societal problem does this tool aim to solve? Where does it derive its value? And so legislators are not particularly attuned to questions like this. And frankly, many of them are not necessarily modern or modern minded or digitally adept. So as a question of policy, there are different arguments to be made, but also as a question of feasibility, when you have an asset, something like Bitcoin, where there is no third party, there is no governing structure that can, for example, reverse payments or undo payments or do anything like that. What that requires then is extreme responsibility and prudence from the custodian. And in the case of United States politicians, in the case of the federal government that regularly loses, I don't mean loses in an investment sense. I mean loses in a misplaced sense. An institution that regularly loses billions of dollars that they just disappear completely unaccounted for. That's a lot of risk to ask a state to invest. Even 1% of some of these reserve funds would be hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a lot to ask a state to take that risk on. when many of them, frankly, aren't armed, are not capable, or not intuitive enough to really grasp that anyway. So I think that they are different, and I think you've seen, like, especially on the federal level, right? You've seen everything from the crypto stuff. The Federal Reserve Bank published a paper over the last couple months about remonetizing America's balance sheet in the context of establishing a gold reserve, or excuse me, in the context of establishing a Bitcoin reserve. You have Senator Lummis in Wyoming. Like I mentioned, she's the U.S. Congressperson, one of two U.S. senators from Wyoming, who is arguably the biggest proponent of Bitcoin in all of Congress. And even in her own state, she can't get a Bitcoin reserve passed, and they're choosing to opt for the gold reserve instead. So I think there's still a lot of education that has to happen. And I think that, frankly, I think that as a question of policy and a policy writing, it muddies the water. And I've already seen this, where Bitcoiners and these crypto groups, because it's not just Bitcoiners, are coming in and they see gold projects that have succeeded over the last 12 years that we've been doing this. And so instead, what they're trying to do is to glom on, or to come in and you take a gold bill that has already made its way far through the process, and then you try to edit Bitcoin in kind of in a clever or cute kind of way. And I don't think that's a good thing as a question of like good policy writing. I also don't think it's a good thing because the arguments then are muddied. Trying to write policy like that, sort of sneakily or backhandedly, one is generally a bad idea, and two, it sort of misunderstands the point, right? There's a weaponization of the political process and the legislative process that happens every day virtually. And so, like, to be honest, or that underscores the importance of passing legislation that is honest, that's forward, and that can last. And so being cute or being crafty about the way you craft this legislation, so as to make it ambiguous, or so as to, sneak past your actual the goals that you actually wish to achieve, I'm not in favor of that.
And the reason I asked that is just to get your thoughts, because here I'm in Michigan, and so Michigan, from what our previous conversation, hasn't been too friendly and open with the idea of gold and silver.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, just over the last couple of months, Michigan State Pension Fund makes 6.6 million Bitcoin ETF investment, and so we have more openness towards the digital side of things. Mm-hmm. And not to go down a lot of rabbit holes, which I am capable of doing, but Governor Whitmer and Donald Trump never saw eye to eye on a lot of things. But it's interesting how Whitmer is okay with allowing this to move forward as of now. And so just stuff like this, it really just makes me wonder, what's the long-term objective with all this? But then again, I have some suspicions.
Well, I think it's an interesting point to make, because, and I haven't read the article, but that article that you just put on there was, I think, spoke to Michigan State. Yeah. So it's more and more. So actually, and this actually raises a great point. The reason more pension funds, reserve funds, rainy day funds, the reason more of these state funds, and even private funds, are not invested in gold or Bitcoin or whatever, is because most of these funds are governed by lists, what are called permissible investment lists, or they're subject to like prudent investor rules that literally explicitly list out what a fund is allowed to and what they are not allowed to invest in. And like I mentioned, these pension funds and these reserve funds are loaded with dollar-denominated debt. They're loaded with third world debt. They're loaded with these things with negative real rates of return, I'll say. And the truth is that these fund managers, in some cases, they're handcuffed. They literally can't invest in any of these other things if they wanted to. So going in and making sure that that fund managers have access and have the ability to invest in the assets that they see, that they think are fit, is an important part of all of this.
Yeah. Now, I'm also curious to get your thoughts on the recent executive order that will open the door up for 401ks to have access to an assortment of things, as well as the private equity to have an opportunity to offer more products to a populace that's not too financial or monetary savvy, and just the lure of higher returns on more junk based products. And so just all this stuff here that makes me just question, because the gold in the 401k being opened up is for the digital space, not for gold and silver. Like, and of course, I understand the goal is not to go backwards. Everybody wants to progress and move forward because of technology and all those selling points. But my goal, and of course yours as well, to really focus on sound, true, tried and tested monetary practices. But what were you surprised at that 401k opportunity being opened up?
I think we're living now we have been for a long time. We're living in an era of hyper, where the point recently has been shifted away from creating value and more towards creating velocity. So like it's a hyper velocity world where money moving, exchanging hands, or money moving from party to party matters more than creating value or creating something that lasts. And so there are so many examples of this. And you talk about this on your show. You like you said there, you've got bad investments being funneled in to people who don't necessarily have the financial aptitude to be able to recognize what is bad and what isn't. You have people that are now investing in this stuff that have never heard the term counterparty risk, that have never considered counterparty risk, safety of principle, have never considered things like monetary history in many cases. And that's what make gold and silver special. And so to your point about like, no one wants to go backwards. That's true. At the same time, classics are classic for a reason. The reason gold and silver have been used for thousands of years as money spread out across the globe, like absent communication all around the world, people finally settled on after using after using salt and tobacco and beads and seashells. They all somehow settled on gold and silver as money. And so like, I wouldn't say it's to go backwards. I would say that it's a renaissance. It is the re-understanding, the recapturing of something that historically society has known for thousands of years. So yeah, and I think we're going to see more of this. Especially we've got an interest rate cut here, which I think is going to be inflationary. I think that you have stock markets at all-time highs, and you're still pouring more gasoline on the fire. I think it doesn't make sense. You're inflating these obviously inflated bubbles. You have Americans that are strapped to more credit card debt than they have in any time in recent history. You have home buyer rates dropping across the country. And then, of course, things like financial insecurity, things like food insecurity, housing insecurity. More and more people are living closer to the quote unquote the proverbial financial edge than before. And these policies of, incentivizing people to gamble, which is essentially what stuff like that is. These policies of printing and inflating the purchasing power out of our currency serve to harm maybe the most vulnerable people among us. So it's, I think, at the beginning, especially when you had such like Doge, and you had that committee, and you had Trump, earlier this year talking about gold and Fort Knox. And so I think there was some reason to be excited as proponents or supporters of honest money, free markets, sound money, the Constitution. But I think we've found, at least as it pertains to this is business as usual. The central planning will continue. The debt will continue. The moral hazards will continue. The weaponization of the financial system as a tool for surveillance will continue. And I think that more and more the impetus for establishing readopting your own gold currency and finding ways to protect yourself from Leviathan are becoming ever more important.
Very true, very true. As we draw towards the end, just curious to get your thoughts on, another issue that it's somewhat, concerning to me as well, the stablecoin narrative. And so, the previous administration put in an executive order to research and develop more of CBDC. Donald Trump came in, canceled that, but yet left the stablecoin narrative in there, and now they've allowed institutions that are approved to be able to create their own stablecoins for the sake of, I guess, propping up the government bond, debt market, things of that nature, all types of stuff. And so, just to look ahead, gold and silver, of course, has proven to be true, tried and tested, a good way for individuals as well as states that you're mentioning to protect and preserve everything they work hard for. But do you see stablecoins somehow, some way being a part of this next issuance? God forbid, some type of crises, and then a government responds and they try to get emergency measures to people's hands. It was stable coins, or have you thought this through, or is this something that you don't really focus on?
Yeah, I think that it's something obviously I've talked about, and even as a question of policy, we have worked with states to pass legislation that prohibits CBDCs in their state. So going into state statute and changing the definition of money so as to preclude any sort of central bank digital currency. But like you said, you're right. The terrain has shifted, and what we're seeing now is stable coins. With this recent, the bills that were passed recently, we're seeing more clarity, I guess, around these institutions. But I think what we also saw was now, for example, the greatest issuer of stablecoins today in the United States, I believe, is Tether, USDT. And what we've found, if you look at Tether's balance sheet, they're very open about the fact that, one, they own a bunch of gold, and they're buying, they're seeking ways to increase exposure to steps along the gold timeline. So it's not just owning physical gold; they're also going in and buying equity stakes in gold mining companies and gold royalty companies. So they're looking at exposure to this. But the flip side of that is that as I'm sure you've heard, they're also, I believe, now the 7th or 8th largest buyers of US Treasuries in the world. And so what has happened here is that they've created a release valve. The US government, or maybe not created, the US government has found a release valve, because at a time where countries all around the world were choosing to buy fewer and fewer treasuries, you now have this large company and companies like it that are actively buying these treasuries. And what we're seeing is, in the case of things like Tether, that can be used all around the world as a way to almost run around banks. You can almost cut banks out entirely if you can create a native dollar that exists in this digital ecosystem and doesn't actually have to come out. What that means is that you've now, and so we're seeing more and more of that, because in many cases, third world countries, even other countries, the financial infrastructure for like banking and that sort of complex infrastructure doesn't really exist. So rates of adoption of things like stablecoins around the world, not in developed countries, but in undeveloped countries, is high. That's important because what we're seeing now is that in this ingenious way, the United States government has exported US Treasuries onto the poorest of people in third world countries, onto people that have never used a US bank, onto people that have never held a US dollar. And somehow people holding and using stable coins have become holders, US Treasury holders, US Treasury stoppers. And yeah, I think more and more we're seeing the issue becomes with programmable money. And to the extent that a central power, be it a government, a central bank, or even a private industry, to the extent that programmable money exists, I think that it is it invites risk, it invites capture, and it's a risk. It's a big risk. So it's something that we need to remain diligent about, and trying to do what you can individually. Like I mentioned, there are ways to do that. Cash. There are fractional gold and silver is more ubiquitous than it's ever been. If you wanted to use precious metals as money, fortunately, advancements in technology have made that possible. And I think that's the sort of thing that more people need to adopt, or at least be mindful of, as you navigate through a world that is becoming increasingly digital and increasingly surveilled.
Well, JP, as always, man, great to connect with you. Have you drop a wealth of knowledge as well as updates as to your efforts to really put gold and silver out there, in legislation to get states to move. And so, for those who may not be familiar, let me just point them back to soundmoneydefenseleague.org, where you can go to get all the updates and the latest information from your organization there. And as always, it's good to connect with you. Looking forward to connecting again. And I was actually looking at. Let me actually just bring this up real quick here. I want to just highlight another thing here that I think is interesting. The last time we connected in April, and so in April of last year, we were about $28 give or take or so. And fast forward to today, we're up to just touch 45. So
Mm-hmm.
silver has definitely responded to all the issues that the world faces. But
And I think that'll run all the way to 50 and beyond. Probably it's not long before gold hits 4,000 and beyond. All of these tailwinds for the price are all still there, and it's the perfect storm of conditions for precious metals. So I'm excited to see what comes next.
100%. Well, as always, as I mentioned, good connecting with you. Continue to do what you do, and as always, looking forward to staying in touch with you. And so, for those who are plugged in, go check JP out. You'll find some links in the description. Also, go show him some love on I think your X as well. Correct? We connect on X, and so you're everywhere. So go plug in with them. And other than that, if you enjoy this, hit that thumbs up, drop a comment, take this, share, give people a better chance of understanding some actions that's taking place to really help people with gold and silver. So, thanks for investing with your presence. Be safe.
Thanks, Mike.